All right. So, Town of Amherst, as mentioned, I'm Supervisor Brian Kulpa, the past mayor of the Village of Williamsville. Um, and uh, and when I talk about the Town of Amherst, no offense to my fellow supervisors who may be in the room, but I refer to it as the Town of Amherst. They're used to hearing me do that, and I do that mostly to just be a smartass, but also because at the end of the day, there's a lot of suburbs in New York State. There's a lot of different townships, and there's really very few things that are like Amherst. Amherst, if you don't know, it's of course the largest township in Western New York, the biggest suburb around the city of Buffalo. But if you look at upstate populations, right, it's really the city of Buffalo, the city of Rochester, Syracuse, and you might expect Albany, but it's not. The town of Amherst, a bigger population in Albany, just behind Syracuse. Um, so it's the largest town upstate, and it's really it's really densified, right? It's 23 public schools, about $127 million operating budget. Um, the population swells to about 188,000 during the day. So there's a lot of vehicle volume, a lot of traffic, a lot of a lot of everything that comes with traffic, right? And a lot of that is because of the higher ed, campuses, right? South Campus, North Campus, Damon, SUNY, Erie, they attracts a lot of crowd in and out. But we get a lot of commuting volume. And of course, we're kind of this old suburban style development throughout parts of the town, especially on the west side. You get the kind of big box retail and the tract housing. And so if you came into my office, you'd probably see a copy of Retrofitting Suburbia lying somewhere around. It's my secular Bible. It basically talks about how you can change and adapt places. That coupled with another book, which is called Sprawl Repair Manual, really talks about taking environments that are asphalt and not very considerate of nature, or not very considerate of water quality, and can turn them into places that really celebrate green infrastructure. So the project that we're going to talk about at Spring Street really started with a partner project. It was Picture Main Street. If you've heard of Picture Main Street, it was one of the first projects in New York State where a municipality led a makeover of a state arterial without a planned state capital project. DOT didn't have a planned capital project on Main Street. Williamsville kind of went out and we did basically everything ourselves, including putting together grant packages, soliciting funding. And that project in its sort of conceptual configuration featured a lot of things. It featured enhanced sidewalks, crossings. It was about mobility, shared mobility, pedestrian access. It didn't put the road on a road diet, but it changed and sought to tweak a lot of elements. Well, off of Main Street, there are all these sort of impervious surfaces and conditions that we had to deal with. So as we were going through the big Picture Main Street endeavor, and that's a look at Main Street, and it's an area of that's kind of how we've sort of repositioned the sidewalks. Did bulb outs, tried to use permeable pavers where we could. As we were repositioning Main Street, we had to look at its sister street, which is Spring Street. So if you've been to Williamsville, you probably know the mill. It's a national landmark. This was it. When I came into the village, it was about in this condition and hadn't been touched. It was in need of a lot of repair. And more importantly, if you look at that street out in front of it, this street carried all of the Main Street runoff, all the runoff from the nearby parking lots, and let it kind of siphon down this alley and right over the escarpment edge. So it silted in ponds at Glen Park and carried all the pollutants right into Ellicott Creek. So we undertook an endeavor to fix the mill and started to plan for a new street, right? So the concept was, let's do something green. Let's do something that reintroduces nature here. Let's do something that seeks to control. We had an audacious goal of 100% stormwater capture, retention, control, bioremediation, and clean and green release into the areas below. Dean Nato Associates, along with Joy Keebler, landscape architect, were the design team for this project. Frankly, chose Dean Nato because they had a previous experience up at the Falls with Old Falls Street. That was always a street that kind of captured my imagination as to what you could do and how you could control stormwater. And this is kind of the plan, of the site plan, if you will. And what it featured was a number of things. I'm not sure. Can anybody see my cursor moving around? Okay. So Main Street runs east-west. Part of Main Street on front of Eagle House and Town Hall and Village Hall doesn't actually have any storm sewer. All that water just sheds, and it sheds down Spring Street and sheds down Rock Street, and then it would literally, in the past, just dump over the escarpment edge around these areas. So this is the mill. So what we said was, look, let's take all that stormwater action off of Main Street. Let's take all of the runoff coming down Spring Street and Rock Street, and then try to gather as much runoff as we can off of these buildings in these parking lots and carry them through a series of stormwater plantings or rain gardens on Rock Street and on Spring Street. Carry them into basically a giant filter system. It uses mechanical, but it's really passive mechanical. I don't have any product in the ground per se, but it uses a series of different kind of a different level of gravel, a different level of crush run and stuff underneath a series of concrete and then permeable pavers. So these are Unilock product. They hold up really well underwater. It's more that high density Unilock product. Then on areas where we couldn't kind of sweep everything back to this plaza or this giant filtration system, we'll use the parking lanes as basically a collection point. So here we use paved drain, which is really a great product. It does break down under salt a little bit too much, and channel it into more of these bioretention planters. So the whole system is meant to drain, ultimately be released through this tiered bioretention wall, which was really kind of a novel concept. I credit the design team for kind of finding this. It's like a helix pattern. It holds plant material kind of in a tiered effect up and down that wall, and there's a kind of a big bioretention swale right at the top of it. So, the mill project was using state historic money, basically SHPO EPF funds. We had help early on from Mary Lou Rath when she was still a state senator. Later on, our Historic Preservation Commission worked directly with SHPO to kind of continue moving the project through. And as we were transforming that project, we were able to try out some stuff. So both Joy Keebler and I believe in tactical urbanism, just trying stuff out, seeing how things look. So a lot of the radii, when you do a bulb out or when you do a planting like this, some of what you hear is the fire company saying we'll never be able to get our vehicles around it. And so we actually tried out some of the stormwater plantings by just bringing in wood chips and plant material, in pots to see what it would look like, how it would look, how it would feel. Volunteers did the kind of quote unquote planting. All that material later got transplanted. In the mill, we started to brush up how we celebrated Christmas. Had Santa, changed that. You put a comic book store and you get away with a lot of other things, which started to attract people, right? even if it was Jedi Training Academy. It started to attract people and attention to that. And this is a look at the project as it was just being completed. So I like this shot. It doesn't, if you go down there today, of course, there's a lot more stuff on it. I like the shot because it's one of the cleanest shots of that mill plaza that we built. The mill plaza was designed to be a public plaza. You can see here clearly the sort of, it's just broom finished concrete, and everything kind of pitches into these areas here where we've got the Unilock product set, and everything underneath is meant to kind of hold and slow the flow of water so it enters the bioswale slowly and in a controlled manner. This is a look up Spring Street. Again, this is right as construction was finishing, so you don't have the vegetation in the planters yet, like you would see today or you saw in the video. But a number of things started to happen, right? This building was empty. The mill was empty. The 3 buildings at the mill were empty. And the building I'm standing next to in this shot was empty. And all these buildings started to fill up because they saw the life and vitality, the nature of the street in front of them. In fact, we had to give both these groups public right-of-way easements to build these patios. But now if you go down there, more Pat and Cher and Sweet Jenny's at the mill, there's a lot of life on that street, really all day, all afternoon, into the evening. This is a look at the green wall, again, before the planting. If you see the video, you'll see it full and lush, but this gives you a good sense of the tier pattern, the helical sort of grid, if you look at it from above, but from the side, you sort of see this plasticky mesh until the plant material kind of grows in front of it. This is our main sort of outfall. This is where we want the water to channel through. It channels into the system that feeds all of the ponds and then ultimately back feeds into the creek. So, this is our collection point now for all that stormwater. My kids tell me, you made it when you make the cover of Grumpy Cat. I don't know if that's true or not, but nevertheless, the project got featured, and so we're happy to see that. So now the challenge that we've taken on, both in Williamsville and in Amherst, is saying, okay, we've got to continue this now. We've created a legacy using a series of Empire State Development grants, GIGP grants, and WQIP grants from New York State DEC, combined with boosts from some SAM grants through Senator Rasenhofer, to pull all that off. But we got to take it a little bit further. Amherst, if you don't know, the southern portion of Amherst is about a 30 to 40 foot escarpment, sits on shallow bedrock, dolomite, right up to about 6.5 feet. What that does is it like supercharges water that gets into the system. You get into the bedrock, it finds a fissure and it goes quick. It gathers and gets going pretty quick. And the north half or the north 2/3 of Amherst, or maybe even 3/4 of Amherst, is an old glacial lake. And if you looked at the soils in that old glacial lake, right, what you would see there is, if you look at the soil map in color, you feel like you should put on a pair of colored sunglasses and start listening to Hendrix, because it's really a trip. So what we're trying to do now is basically daisy chain a series of green infrastructure projects throughout the southern edge of the town of Amherst, so that we can control and take as much of the stormwater runoff off of our old traditional street grids and parking lots and stuff, and put it through its rigors in a green infrastructure system and create sort of a town-wide biofilter. And we started that process right at the Village of Williamsville. We did it along South Long already. If you go to South Long is the street where D. Camillo's is cornered on Main Street. That park area, these were kind of just concept sketches. But that project really got moving with green infrastructure. Again, GIGP and WQIP grants working in tandem. We're doing it with the same grants at Delwood Statler, which is kind of it's a park that we're going to take all of the stormwater runoff off of Longmeadow and Delwood and some of these old post-war tract housing streets. And this is really the first time that anybody in the state has taken a post-war tract housing subdivision and took all the stormwater and fed it into bioremediation. We're doing it at Statler Park with big catchment area, but we're basically using a series of green infrastructure measures through both parks to do that. And kind of a look at what future measures may look like. How green infrastructure systems can work within a. But Amherst isn't stopping there. We're kind of exploring, right? We've got this picturesque waterfall coming over the escarpment edge, but like I said, the nature of it is we have a lot of water power, right? This isn't after anything special. This is a heavy rain, and so what we're looking at now is retrofitting the dam at Island Park with low flow hydroelectric generation. Looking at building a series of these kind of small chamber sort of inline turbines along Ellicott Creek. These are fairly low flow. You don't need a ton of elevation to build them. This isn't about green infrastructure, but it's about clean infrastructure, and they go hand in hand. So as we kind of continue with this perspective of green, our attention's really sort of turned to the west side of the town. That's an interesting area of the town. We have 9 low mod census tracts. It's the second highest density in all of Western New York after the village of Kenmore. And we've got 2 active sanitary sewer overflows, SSOs in that area, which lead to 2 environmental justice zones. So it's an area that's both economically challenged in terms of property turnover and home ownership. It's an area where we know we need to do some significant work in terms of retreating streets and doing stormwater control. What we're doing at Longmeadow and Statler is going to help this, but it's only a start. So we're looking at other projects and moving forward with some other projects that kind of re-envision these areas, and where we have a hard time retrofitting dense neighborhood grids, we're taking advantage of locations like this, right? My favorite eminent domain project in all its glory, turning abandoned fields into stormwater collection systems, green parks and infrastructure, kind of cutting off the water where it starts, using small stormwater, rain gardens and small stormwater collection units. That's a future. I should have used that instead. We partner with some private schools. Park School did this with their science building. If you haven't been there, they did a collection off of 100% collection off of their building and their site improvements. They feed into a pond that's always been silted over, frankly was dead and stagnant. They did a recirculation system where they pumped it back up and they're circulated through a creek, and now there's all sorts of life in that pond again. And the water that they're pushing out into neighboring areas because of groundwater and stuff is clean, and it's been aerated, and it's got all sorts of benefits to the area, including sort of aesthetic benefits. And then the big thing that you've seen probably in the Buffalo News, if you haven't, there's a couple of articles out there, but we've got this big legacy green space right in the middle of town. So this isn't us, this is Birchfield down in West Seneca, but this started to kind of shape how we envisioned Delaware Park, of course, how we envisioned an approach to Westwood, where in Westwood, it's Ellicott Creek gets really channelized, and it's been channelized for some time. So we were working with Army Corps of Engineers on some early concepts to take Westwood, use the weir that sits at Westwood near Maple Road, or the Ellicott Creek near Maple Road, and use that, kind of carve out the old floodplain that was at Westwood to restore sort of littoral immersion and riparian wetlands in that area. And this is a kind of an overall perspective of what we're thinking about doing there. Westwood is down here. It's a country club, about 171 acres. This is that kind of dredged out wetland reservoir lake that we're talking about doing. You can see a number of these kind of wet areas or new kind of created spaces for stormwater. And what we're talking about here ultimately is a better look at, right, is basically going back a couple of major kind of, using the existing kind of grade lines, taking out all that fill that was put in to channelize the creek and sort of letting that creek take its natural turn. When it hit this 90-degree bend, it used to just kind of flood out in back in the day, and that's what we're hoping to restore. So that process is moving along. It's something we're pretty proud of. I think this is going to be a great benefit to a lot of people. And then the final, is the Boulevard Mall site, right? It's 64 acres. We had to figure out how to work through a zoning that envisioned this sea of asphalt that basically dumps a lot of stormwater into our underground collection system and takes it right to Ellicott Creek over by Tonawanda, or infamously floods Niagara Falls Boulevard and Maple, and do stuff on site to make it, so our zoning calls for street trees and green plantings along the streets. It also means that there has to be at least 10% dedication of green space collected in bigger green space. You can't just spread it out. You have to collect it. So we're going to get to do new public parks and really take, that sea of asphalt and regreen it over time. It's not just about adding density, but it's adding stormwater features, and it's about facilitating people and green. It's about cleaning up, legacy big box and legacy parking lots and legacy concentrations of salt and pollutants and acidity, and making them sophisticated green spaces. We've even been looking at just for the sake of giving the NFTA something to think about. We've even been looking at, if the light rail is going to come, of doing that on green medians and green islands in Niagara Falls Boulevard and along Maple. And that's, to me, this is pretty stunning because, this is ultimately how you change a place and how you change your perception of stormwater and your perception of gray water. And so that's what I've got to share.
Great. Fantastic, Brian. It looks like you guys are doing a lot of really nice, good things up there. It's impressive.
We've put an emphasis on stormwater collection, control, and remediation as a way to not only be environmental stewards, but also to frankly beautify the town, and use those elements to our benefit. I actually don't know how to stop sharing this, so so you might be staring at my screen for a little while here. But the notion that that you've got an asset in this gray water that people don't think about as an asset, right? Think about how you get rid of stormwater, how do you mitigate it, and we're like, no, we can turn it into a feature, and that's kind of what we're really after.
That's great. Does anybody have any questions for Brian before we move on?
Hey, Brian, this is Mark. I guess I got a couple of questions.
Sure.
Number one, I know a couple of those sites you're working with some private developers and such. Are you getting good response on some of those types of projects from those developers?
Yeah. Well, look, when you say, hey, we're going to do green infrastructure and street trees and stuff, they kind of look at you funny. And then you say, it's in the zoning. Okay, well, I guess we're doing street trees and green infrastructure. I will say Douglas Jamal we had developed this concept plan working with Douglas. We worked with him on the concept drawing. He kind of gave me a thumbs up, sort of tentative sign off on it, and then looked at me again and said, "We need more pocket parks. It needs to be more green. People need more space." And I said, "Okay, that's great." I think that's a mindset that he's kind of he develops in DC, right? So in Washington, there's a lot of these sort of public green spaces and that radio grid, and they're used to seeing the big public malls and all the national monument stuff. So I think he just wants to give people access to things like that. The other groups are I think they're coming along for the ride. But again, it's about changing the zoning and a little bit it's about just dictating. This is what we want as a town.
And I guess the second question would be, is I know you've got an extensive planning background. How much does that play into this push? And would you foresee someone who might not have that planning background being able to?
So look, here's the deal, right? Most people, you'll hear, I think it's true. Probably every supervisor in Western New York would say they want main streets that are inhabitable to pedestrians. Like that stuff's becoming pretty accepted. So converting that to say inhabitable pedestrians means what? Does it mean more street trees? Yeah. Does it mean changing your sidewalk pattern and configuration? Yeah. Does it add some pavers? Yeah. You almost have to walk into hey, by the way, you've got a green infrastructure project. You might not know it, right? But you have one. You just have to package it that way. Realistically, I knew inherently when I started the process for Spring Street that we'd be able to find some kind of funding to do stormwater mitigation, especially because we had the Escarpment Edge, we had Glen Park, we had the Ellicott Creek. And that's kind of how I started the project. The project was really, at first it was about the mill siting and Main Street. And then we got preoccupied by, where the stormwater surge was. Selling it back to the community was simple, right? So, once you say, if I said streetscape, people would have said, do we want to spend the money? If I said stormwater mitigation, pollutant control, good for the environment, people in Williamsville took off like a rocket behind me. It became very easy to get buy-in. So I think it has two stories. First, from a starting block, I may have been thinking about it more because of my background. And we worked early on with, One River Keeper, now Water Keeper, to talk about some of what we wanted to accomplish. But, the nature of it is even if somebody's not thinking, if you're working with consultants, you'd like to think a consultant is bringing these measures to the table on a project, whether it's a streetscape or a park beautification or something. And I know Tonawanda did this with Lincoln Park. I think Jim Jones had they got an EPF grant, not EPF, I'm sorry, a GIGP grant to do the trail system at Lincoln Park. The nature of this is we're not the first one out of the block either, right? The Buffalo Sewer Authority and transformations of the city. We may have been one of the first groups to use this successfully on an already split system. And SHPO was working on the mill, so it became easy for EFC to say, hey, let's double up on state resource here. You've got to always look for ways to leverage things, but it's a matter of support the green infrastructure with good programming. So Delwood Statler, it's not a standalone project. We went to Senator Rasenhofer and said we'd like to build a Challenger baseball diamond. And we had programming going into the park as well. That made one state agency looking at another state agency can help. So yeah, I think that it's easy to get going on once you introduce the concept. The first step is getting people to think about it.
Good. Great YouTube, by the way.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, that's what. So we've got the police have gotten very good at filming stuff for us in the town of Amherst during COVID, and I kind of begged them to do one more for me, and all of a sudden they became like this documentary production group. So I had to buy new microphones and cameras for them, but that's okay.
Do you mind if we share that on social media?
Oh no, I think it's good. I really want to tell people the story of what's going on there, because I think the systems work well. Waterkeepers was good monitoring. We proved that we did it. It was successful. And if you go to Glen Park now and you look at the ponds that used to be a wreck, now they're full of life. It's just a different feel there. So
That's
Great.
awesome. I have another question. Just curious, I know that you kind of put together a lot of different state grants for these projects. Did you, were you able to use town funds like cash match, or were you in-kind matching some of those grants with, highway folks or someone who was helping out with those projects? Or how did you end up meeting the match requirements for that?
So we did everything. We actually, so we hired I had to replace Ken Kostoniak in the middle of all this as my public works crew chief. Ben Villanen, who's a registered landscape architect, came on board. That gave us the capacity to do more in kind. He had a better sense of the plant material and some of that stuff. But we did just about everything we could to squeeze as much volume out of that. At the end of the day, there was some bond issuance for the overall project, but the majority of it was grants and in-kind contribution. And then, like I said, that the nature of it, right? You stay after a project, you got to find 2 or 3 resources. You can't. Very seldom are you going to find one grant that's just going to pilot the entire program. You gotta, if you really want to make it excel, you have to find 2 or 3 things. I think we blended in some NYSERDA funding for changing out, some of the old flood lighting that we had there, the old Cobra heads. We went to LED street lighting and stuff like that. So there were a lot of different elements that went into that project.
Nice. And then I had another question just about your zoning. Do you explicitly in your zoning law require green infrastructure or certain things above and beyond what the state requires for development?
So in the village zoning, which we did right before I left, we didn't get strong enough in my mind. We talked about green infrastructure as an element that we wanted them to consider. And when we had the same shot at doing the commercial zoning in the town, we specifically tell them, that you beyond stormwater handling, you also have to have green space for people. So one of the best ways to deal with your stormwater and invest in public accessible green space, assuming the developers want to maximize their development area, is not to put, a giant retention swale, which have some merit, but not just to put a giant retention swale that's just going to slowly empty back out into a storm system, but really to integrate green infrastructure practice so that you're using it in your active areas. An example of what we're doing right now, Damon College is looking at building a quad, taking out its center parking lot. And they wanted to create some space in the middle for student recreation, student activities, student access. And we said, look, don't just build a quad where you're building a lawn that is going to capture some of it, but let all the water shed, downhill still. Build a quad that's going to have some green infrastructure components to it, rain gardens and such, where you're going to actually collect that and make it better than it was a parking lot. And I think a lot of people think they get away with grass, and it's like, no, just you got to go further, right? So,
Cool.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, good. Well, thank you everybody for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for putting up with a presentation during COVID via electronic media. But I'm glad I had the opportunity, and hopefully it adds to the conversation moving forward.